So, same deal as last time. This is basically another concerned citizens class presentation. Again, I'm not an expert on any of the things I'm going to talk about. What I'm doing that I hope is worthwhile is bringing together the thoughts of very diverse experts and adding my own reflections. Criticisms welcome, as ever. So, The Poetry of Productivity. I won't say too much about that title. I basically just mean that productivity often works in strange ways, kind of intriguingly so, kind of satisfyingly so. And by productivity, I mean really just the ability to achieve what we want to. So, the sort of implicit or sometimes explicit mainstream productivity formula I take to be something like this. I'll just read it out. If you want something a lot, and you keep your eyes on the prize, and you don't waste much time on other things, and you're methodical, you plan well, and take full advantage of the assets you have, and avoid any unforced errors, then your chances of getting it will be maximized. Yeah, that might seem intuitively like it might be kind of right, more or less right. Well, I'm going to be calling every bit of that formula into question in multiple ways. Please note that I'm going to be playing devil's advocate here. I'm going to be self-consciously making very one-sided arguments, and that's because there obviously is quite a lot of sense to this stuff. I mean, the mainstream productivity formula. Sure, if you want to achieve something, you're best off being determined and focused and methodical and so on. But only up to a point. There are limitations and important qualifications to be made, and they're what I want to talk about here. Central to the arguments I want to make is this concept of obliquity. The term obliquity, oblique is a kind of geometric term. It means a slanting angle, basically, neither parallel nor at right angles. Then in everyday speech, when we describe something as oblique, we mean it has an indirect, perhaps non-obvious or even disguised nature. So you can talk about, I don't know, oblique messages someone's been giving you. Now, the term obliquity, as I'm going to use it here, has a slightly more specific meaning than that. It's a meaning that I think was first articulated by the pharmacologist James Black, who says here that he used to advise colleagues who were interested in making a lot of money that there were better ways of doing that than pharmacology, and so they should probably stop being pharmacologists. But then apparently he, just enjoying being a pharmacologist, made a lot of money, and those who departed the profession to earn their millions didn't tend to. So he concluded, you're often most successful in achieving something when you were trying to do something else. And this he called the principle of obliquity. So that concept of obliquity was then taken up by the economist John Kay in his book, Obliquity, Why Our Goals Are Best Achieved Indirectly. And in that book, he's mostly focused on how the businesses that generate the biggest profits are typically not businesses that have profit generation as their dominant concern. They'd be businesses instead like maybe technological businesses that have at their absolute core this great fascination with the science behind the technology they're working on, or they would be businesses run by mostly people who have a passion for the ins and outs of business management, or perhaps ideally both of those sorts of people. But if you have people who are really just interested in increasing profits at the core of your business, then that is likely to be very problematic, Kay thinks, because they are likely to take shortcuts, or they just won't have the care and motivation and sensibility necessary to do a good job of really nurturing what it is in the business that makes the business succeed. Kay is mostly focused on this business economics application of the concept of obliquity, naturally enough, as he's an economist. The concept has far broader reach, though, and he does speak about that broader reach to some extent. I'm going to focus on that broader reach here. Just to give you immediately an idea of the extent of that broader reach, this is a passage from the psychologist Viktor Frankl's 1992 introduction to his book Man's Search for Meaning, in which he talks about his experiences as a prisoner in Nazi concentration camps, and then sets out the basics of the psychotherapeutic school he established, logotherapy. I'll just read the underlined bit there. Don't aim at success, he says. The more you aim at it and make it a target, the more you are going to miss it. For success, like happiness, cannot be pursued. It must ensue, and it only does so as the unintended side effect of one's dedication to a cause greater than oneself. So in Kay's terms, this is very clearly the claim that happiness and success follow the principle of obliquity, right? And incidentally, though that was from the 1992 introduction, Frankl says some very similar things in the main text of the book, published back in 1946. And there he gives male sexual potency as an example, saying that it must remain a side effect or byproduct and is destroyed and spoiled to the degree to which it is made a goal in itself. He gives female orgasm as another such example. So there you go, read a philosophical book on the Holocaust and get potentially game-changing sex tips along the way. There's obliquity for you. Anyway, these quotes also nicely illustrate that, of course, the idea of obliquity is far older than that term. I mean, I think the idea must have been around in some form or other for pretty much ever. Anyway, to ensure you've got the idea clear in your mind, and maybe just for fun, take a moment now to try and think of some other examples. Examples of things that you are sometimes more able to achieve when you're not actively trying to, but rather when you're doing something else entirely and it just emerges as a byproduct of that. So one example that occurs to me, often when I'm working on some writing project, the best way for me to figure out what to write next is not to keep sitting there consciously trying to work it out, but instead to get up and walk off and do something else, especially something physical that leaves my mind largely free to just wander. And then often as not, it just sort of comes to me. Another one of my favorites, if we fall down some stairs, say, we're actually normally better off not bracing ourselves for the impact. I mean, we somehow do ourselves less damage that way because we sort of roll or otherwise move with the impact, and so we expend the force of the impact in that movement rather than sort of taking the whole brunt of it in one go. Or I've heard that anyway. Okay, so let's start now with the first part of that mainstream productivity formula I mentioned a few slides ago. The idea that you're more likely to achieve something if you want it a lot. What's wrong with that? Well, in answer to each line of the formula, I'm going to discuss a different thread of obliquity, and I use that word thread because I think they overlap quite a lot. So, first thread of obliquity I want to present, winning the game versus playing the game. Now, I've worded it like that because in thinking about this thread of obliquity, I've been thinking especially about sport. I mean, you often hear this said by or about sports people, right? That they need that desire, that hunger to win. They need to have it more than their opponents. But I think that's just not especially true. I think that a desperate desire to win easily backfires. And I'm going to talk about 5 ways in which that can happen in a moment. But what this illustration shows is perhaps another, I think, well, I take it to be a sort of spin on the Sisyphus myth. The guy's pushing the boulder up the hill. His aim is to get it to the top, and yet if he pushes it too hard, he'll likely cause it to, as he gets to the top, immediately roll on down the other side. And you can imagine something similar happening in, say, a job interview where you over-prepare and you're over-eager in response to the questions you're asked. You may be a bit sycophantic and you put them off, whereas if you'd just taken the whole thing casually, you would have got the job. So these are cases where it's just not really occurred to you that you could go over the top, because that's not always the case, right? Like if if Arsenal beat Man City 10-0 instead of just 5-0, that's just more impressive, right? It's not like they've gone too far and so they actually lose now. So that is maybe one other example of what can go wrong in some cases if you're too desperate to achieve your goal. Here, though, are the 5 main scenarios that I have in mind. So first, the desperate desire to win has an inevitable flip side, which is a violent fear of not winning. And yeah, I really do think that is an inevitability, the existence of that flip side. If you want something a lot, that just entails that you're very afraid of not getting it. Now, the fear may be kind of latent if you're very confident, but it just takes a slip or two, or even seeing someone else slip, and the fear can suddenly become very active indeed. And fear can be debilitating. Fear can distract, fear can persuade, fear can switch your brain into a whole different state, a kind of extra cautious survival mode in which creativity is inhibited. So particularly if you're engaging in an activity that requires creative thinking, which sport typically does, fear of failure could seriously undermine your efforts. So that's one way. Plus then second, the fear of failing can in some cases even cause us to unconsciously or semi-consciously sabotage our own efforts. So imagine the footballer who doesn't train all that hard, or in the match doesn't chase some crucial balls, doesn't take some crucial shooting opportunities or whatever. Or maybe they even eat unhealthily or get drunk or stay up all night before games. And so, of course, they don't perform to the best of their ability. And quite possibly they do that, really, though they might not be conscious of this, because then at least they can maintain the belief that if they tried properly, or if they didn't have these obstacles in the way of them, then they would really succeed. Then they would be the best. And that can be such a crucial sustaining belief for them to have. If they lose that belief, they perhaps lose their sense of their identity or destiny or ultimate value. Imagine if you really try your absolute best and you still come up short at an activity that you're largely dedicating your life to, largely basing your esteem and self-esteem on. That's heavy. That can be crushing. So it's better, a part of your brain can understandably conclude, to not truly try your best and ensure that you always have a good set of excuses, and so never have to face that situation. Yeah, that's another big problem that desperation to succeed, or rather fear of not succeeding, can have. And actually, even if you're not in the grip of the fear, even if all you're experiencing is that positive but very strong desire to succeed, that can still cause similar problems, because if you're desperate to win, you have, and here's the third point, a strong incentive to not try out new moves or strategies that might not work out, and instead stick with the tried and tested. And sometimes perhaps you don't even stick to what's tried and tested by you. You stick to what is known to be tried and tested publicly. Either way, if you stick to what's tried and tested, then you'll be less likely to learn and improve. Basically, there is a tension between winning and learning, because the fact is you often learn more when you lose, or at least seriously risk losing. So if you're too fixated on this need to win, you're just not going to be learning so much, and so you'll end up in the long run losing more. And so the desperate desire to win is again self-defeating. Now, fourth way, if you're desperate to succeed at some activity, say you're desperate to be the best violinist in the orchestra, desperate to get the solo roles, etc., well, then that desperation can cause the activity to feel increasingly serious, solemn, stressful. That is to say, the feeling of a need to win can sometimes take the joy out of the game. And then on some level, a very important level, you're not so motivated to even engage in it. You've lost some of the intrinsic motivation you had for engaging in it. And that can have a cost. Maybe it means you stop dedicating quite so many hours to it. Maybe it means that even though you dedicate just as many hours to it, you're not paying the same kind of rapt attention you were before. You're less invested. Your heart isn't in it so much. It's a revealing little expression we have there. And then a final way, maybe the most important way, that a strong, especially a very strong desire to succeed at some activity can be self-defeating. It can destabilize your whole life. And if your whole life is destabilized, so is your engagement in that activity. Because, of course, your engagement in that activity is part of your life. How can a desperate desire to succeed at some activity destabilize your whole life? Well, it can cause you to make huge sacrifices in your attempt to succeed at that activity. Maybe of friends and family, maybe of rest, maybe of joy, maybe of opportunities to learn and grow as a person. Or put differently, it can cause you to take big risks in your attempts to succeed at that activity. Maybe risks to your health or your financial stability or your relationships, etc., etc. Or related to that, it can cause you to be lured by the prospect of cheating, which might backfire, of course, result in your disqualification or whatever. And even if it doesn't, it might be self-defeating in yet another more specific way, in that, well, it might appear to be a great victory you've got through cheating, but then you might just realize it's an empty victory. It's kind of meaningless. It's not, in fact, what you were so desperate for, what you made all those sacrifices for. In short, success in life is so often achieved on the basis of various kinds of balance, it seems to me. And the desire to succeed, when it goes beyond certain thresholds, can destroy those balances. I think so many ambitious people get stuck in these traps I've described here. And also, I think that with a lot of very ambitious people who avoid these traps, at least temporarily, there's a flukishness to that avoidance. So the alternative, these are a few things Lionel Messi has said at various points. I'm just happy with the ball at my feet. My motivation comes from playing the game I love. I love every single minute I get on the pitch. There are more important things in life than winning or losing a game. So this sentiment is something I've heard from a lot of great sports people. It's also something I've heard from great scientists, great artists. Generally, people at the top of their game tend, in my impression, to just really love playing that game and be definitely not unmotivated by the prospect of winning at that game, but a lot less motivated by that. And I don't mean to claim that no one at the top of their game is extremely motivated by the prospect of success in it. Of course, some are. I'm talking only about tendencies, right? So individual cases with their unique sets of factors can go against what I'm saying here, I'm sure. Anyway, I'm trying on this slide now to compare these two motivators. On the one hand, the joy of playing the game, and on the other, the joy of winning the game. Could equally be the joy of learning and the joy of getting good academic grades or whatever. Just I'll proceed with the sports examples. So I'm comparing the two motivators. I'm trying to think out how they differ. Maybe if you're interested in that question, pause here and just examine the slide. But yeah, basically I'm observing how the joy of playing a game is more specific and textured than the joy of winning it, and also more active and temporal and more unconditionally valued and more easily accessible. And perhaps most important of all, the joy of playing the game contains micro instances of the joy of winning, in scoring a goal or whatever. Whereas the joy of winning the game does not seem to contain micro instances of the joy of playing. And all of this together, it makes me think that maybe the joy of winning games, the joy of achieving glory in some activity, was not historically such a great motivator for us as it is today. And it's really the social circumstances, the way we have our social lives structured and framed now, that has turned that joy into a far more dominant motivator. It's just a theory, but we document our lives now so much more than we ever did before in many ways, through social media, through CVs and profiles, through photographs and videos, through documents, through even just the practice of writing, which is not something many human beings were doing at all until comparatively recently in history. And our long-term identities are also formalized and insisted upon by the state and other institutions. They always want our full name, date of birth, etc. And they've got their records on all of us and our interactions with them over the years, including records of how we've performed in many ways. Meanwhile, we spend a lot more time outside of intimate circles than we ever did before. And in an intimate circle, I mean family, close friends, your public achievements, sure, that's nice. They can feel proud of you, but they're normally going to love you and care about you and have a lot of time for you, irrespective of such achievements. Whereas if you're dealing with people you're less intimate with, then I think really your record of public achievements has a far bigger impact on how people are going to treat you, whether they have time for you, whether and how they value you. And then also in our culture now, we have all these ways in which we're presented with sort of heroic personal narratives, through films, TV series, novels, comic books, biographies, interviews with famous people, etc. I mean, people always told stories around the campfire, I'm sure, but we've in a way really sort of fine-tuned these storytelling methods and technologies now, right? And they can maybe get into our heads, especially with the music, the emphatic camera angles in films and so on. And they can have an impact on how we think of ourselves in a way that they just couldn't before. I had a friend who decided to stop watching films and TV series, or at least stop watching them nearly so much, because of how much he felt they were shaping and in fact distorting his sense of what his life was and should be. Other people stop using social media for similar reasons. No doubt there's always been a primal joy to winning and having won. I don't mean for a second to deny that, but it does seem to me that we have this social and cultural infrastructure that gives winning this whole other bigger dimension now. Also, a side note, it would be fascinating to consider this stuff alongside Galen Strawson's thinking on episodic and diachronic mentalities. Just a nice little term paper for someone there. Or also to consider it alongside the concept of the work ethic, especially as discussed by Elizabeth Anderson. All right, on to keep your eyes on the prize, the second component of our mainstream productivity formula, and therefore the second of our 6 threads of obliquity. This one I've called contentless end goals versus contentful now goals. I'll explain what I mean by those slightly strange terms in a moment. First, what I'm suggesting with the image on this slide is that in this idea that you should keep your eyes on the prize, i.e. really focus very much on your ultimate goal, there is perhaps a lack of respect of the in-between steps, or it's like there's the implicit belief there that if you are very motivated by an ultimate goal, that means you will also necessarily have and be motivated enough by sub-goals through which you can get to that ultimate goal. But I don't think that's true. I think that if you're too focused on your ultimate goal, you might not have the kind of focus necessary to discover and take the steps necessary to get there. Okay, so here are 3 examples of what I mean by contentless end goals and 3 examples of what I mean by contentful now goals. They're my terms, I should say, hence perhaps their ineloquence. Still, hopefully I'll be able to make their meanings clear enough now. So the 3 contentless end goals: to earn a lot of money, to make the world a better place, to be a great artist, all very common goals for people to have, each in some sense quite different from the others, but in another sense all 3 of them are quite similar because they're all contentless, in the sense that the process of achieving them, of realizing them, could involve almost anything. There are so many different ways in which you could earn a lot of money. There are so many different ways in which you could make the world a better place. And there are so many different ways in which you could be a great artist. Different medium, different subjects, different styles, etc., etc. So yeah, if you have these kinds of goals, it's not actually at all clear what you then have to go and do to achieve them. No specific course of action, no specific activity arises from the goal itself. You need to sort of look around for content and hope that you're sufficiently engaged by it and competent at it for you to then get to this goal you want to get to with it. In contrast, look at the 3 contentful now goals: to play football, to work on the puzzle of more efficient batteries, to tell the beautiful story of your grandmother's wartime experience. If you have these goals, you know pretty immediately what you have to do. There is not this gap. There are not these missing steps between having the goal and knowing what to do to realize it, or a lot less so anyway. It's perhaps more like 2 ends of a spectrum of types of goals. Another more cautious claim I'd make about the difference between the two, building on the previously described thread of obliquity, I think contentless end goals tend to be more motivated by the expectation of rewards, of pleasure, of the esteem of others, of self-esteem even, while contentful now goals tend to be more motivated by just the joy of doing them, the curiosity, the sense of meaningfulness, the satisfaction of doing them. But yeah, not so sure about that one. Anyway, the crucial thing about these contentless end goals, as I call them, is that they can be self-defeating if you're too into them, too obsessed by them. So take the example of the artist. This line from C.S. Lewis's novel, The Great Divorce, is addressed to a very ambitious artist. If you are interested in the country only for the sake of painting it, you'll never learn to see the country. And we could continue the thought, if you never really see the country, you won't be able to paint it well, right? So I take the basic thought here to be that great art comes out of seriously caring about something specific aside from art, because that then is the content of the art. Or to make the same point from the other side, if you're viewing something instrumentally, always with an eye on how it can serve some big goal of yours, how it will help make you a great artist or make you a lot of money, you're perhaps not going to be able to engage with it on its own terms. You're not going to be able to see it for what it is. Because, yeah, in your eyes, it's not what it is. It's instead a route to something else. But if you never see it for what it is and never learn to, love it for what it is, will you be able to engage with it in such a way that you'll be able to make great art from it or create a great business out of it or whatever? Right then, next up is don't waste much time on other things, the third part of our mainstream productivity formula. And thus our third thread of obliquity, narrow focus versus interconnectivity. Basically, it's often claimed that tunnel vision or narrow focus on your goals will necessarily help you achieve them. So for instance, if you want to be a great ballet dancer, if you're serious about that, you better focus all your efforts on your dancing. Don't let anything else distract you. That is, I've been told, the standard advice you'll be given by your teachers and your peers and so on. And I've heard of similar advice for people who want their businesses to take off and for people who want to run for public office and get elected and bring about political change. Focus, focus, focus. But I'm not so sure. So I think the essential reason that narrow focus or tunnel vision is liable to, in fact, hinder you in achieving your goals is that everything is connected, deeply, complicatedly connected. So if you want to draw a line between what relates to your goal and what doesn't, what can help you get there and what can't, you're going to have some difficulty. I mean, if you're perceptive, you're going to. And you're going to risk cutting off a lot of stuff that would actually do a lot to help you and maybe even be the very thing that would make the difference between great success on the one hand and struggling mediocrity on the other. So I'm going to talk in this slide and the next two about three ways in which everything is connected, each of which is, it seems to me, really, really important to understand and not widely enough understood. So first, to be focused on this slide, some things might connect to your area of interest or your goal in that they are directly adjoining it, such that they are significantly feeding into and out of it and are determining a large part of what it is. Call this adjoining connectedness. So take the example of an academic discipline. Suppose you want to be a great economist. John Maynard Keynes, one of the most renowned and influential economists of the last century, and also noted for the breadth of his interests, talks here about how to be a good economist, to really understand the economy, you need to have an understanding of so many different things. You probably need to be a decent mathematician. It's a pretty mathematical discipline. You also need to really understand people and how they tick, if you're going to understand how the economy works. And to understand people, it will probably help to have some familiarity with psychology and what we call behavioral science these days. I mean, that's why behavioral economics has sort of upended many psychologically illiterate assumptions of previous generations of economists. And to understand psychology all that well, you probably need some grasp of how the brain works just on a neurological level, maybe the body as well. And to understand the body and brain well, you probably have to have some grasp of biology, etc., etc. And yeah, to really understand people, probably also literature and the other arts are just as crucial, as they often capture deep elements of human nature more powerfully and revealingly than psychological studies. And to be a great economist, you also need to know quite a lot about politics, how political movements and decisions shape the economy, maybe sociology and anthropology for similar reasons. And what about the very moral and intellectual foundations of the discipline as we currently have it? Shouldn't you be questioning them? They've changed over the decades, over the centuries. The most celebrated economists of all are the ones who change the foundational beliefs of the discipline. But if you're going to do that, you're entering the territory of philosophy. Or maybe not. Maybe you question those foundations because of your understanding of emergent technologies and the effect they'll have on economic life through mass unemployment or monitoring of workers or whatever, or because of your understanding of earth sciences and environmental sciences. You know, central to running an economy is resource management, and so the economist better have a sense of how you do that. And that means understanding to some degree also the resources themselves, the natural resources, the human resources, etc., etc. So you see, it's all connected. And I think that is true of every field of thought, maybe slightly less true, or at least differently true of some, of pure mathematics, say. Anyway, remember, this is all just one of my three types of connectedness. This is what I've called adjoining connectedness. I've spoken about academic fields here because narrow focus or excessive specialization in academia is a particular hate of mine. And I think it's extremely dangerous too. I mean, it seems to me that many huge problems in our world have resulted from, or at least been very much encouraged by, influential economists having shockingly little understanding of some of these crucial adjoining disciplines. But yeah, I don't need to focus on academic disciplines. I can speak of anything in life, anything at all, I think. So just as economics crucially adjoins maths, politics, etc., so being a medical doctor, for example, crucially adjoins psychological and care work, fitness coaching, dietary guidance, chemistry and pharmacology, ethics, meditation, etc., etc., etc. It's all connected. You can quote me on that. So that was adjoining connectedness. Now here's another type of connectedness. Let's call it, for want of a better term, similarity connectedness. When I speak about this form of connectedness, I'm really speaking about how there are these common cores of experience, or at least recurring patterns, in very diverse parts of our lives, parts that are not adjoining in any obvious sense. So we can, I think, learn things in one domain of life, which we can then use in a completely different domain of life. And I think this is nicely illustrated by these two quotes here. First, Albert Camus, the philosopher and fiction writer, said, "After many years in which the world has afforded me many experiences, what I know most surely about morality and obligations I owe to football." Hard perhaps immediately to know what he means by that. Like, is he saying he learnt more about morality from football than from, I don't know, reading Kant or Plato or Spinoza, or from the Second World War or the experience of fatherhood? You might even ask, how on earth could he learn anything of importance about morality from football? Well, I think there's a lot we could say in answer to that question, and I mean to address it more fully elsewhere. But for now, we can perhaps get an idea of at least some of what Camus has in mind from this other quote by the fiction writer Haruki Murakami. Most of what I know about writing, I've learned through running every day. These are practical physical lessons. How much can I push myself? How much rest is appropriate and how much is too much? How far can I take something and still keep it decent and consistent? When does it become narrow-minded and inflexible? How much should I be aware of the world outside, and how much should I focus on my inner world? To what extent should I be confident in my abilities, and when should I start doubting myself? I know that if I hadn't become a long-distance runner when I became a novelist, my work would have been vastly different. So he's getting these insights powerfully, viscerally through his running, which he can then use in other parts of his life, including his writing. And these insights are, for the most part, I would guess, non-intellectual in the sense that he's not thinking them out in words. He's feeling these things. He's intuiting them. He knows instinctively, intuitively, better how to approach this grueling task of writing a novel, say, because of his many experiences running marathons and ultra marathons. Just because, and this is the crucial point, there's a core similarity between the two activities. Both running and writing involve willpower, discipline, form, pain and exhaustion and endurance, traps of self-doubt and self-confidence, alertness to detail and awareness of the bigger picture, and struggles over all of these things. And you can learn from those struggles irrespective of which of the activities you're engaged in, and you can then make use of what you've learnt when engaged in the other activity. And maybe also important to stress, I think these kinds of lessons Murakami is referring to are not just like one-off conveyances of facts, like the date of a coronation or something. No, these are lessons that need to be continually relearned, like moral lessons typically. You know, you have to be reminded of your limitations, your frailties, your great potential, your deeper reserves of energy, your means of self-motivation, your slippery slides into complacency. And Murakami finds that he's reminded of these things, kept in touch with them most through his running. You can imagine a friend saying, "Why are you running so much, Haruki? You should just focus on your writing, as that's what's most important to you, surely." But that friend would be clueless, right? Because, yeah, if Murakami focused solely on the writing, he'd be missing out on this crucial series of lessons, which is maybe in more than one way what's been helping give him his edge in his writing. And of course, running and writing are far from unique in this respect. You can find transferable lessons in almost any sphere of life, particularly if you engage in it deeply. So Robert M. Persig's Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, which I read earlier this year, described, especially at the start, a lot of crucial life lessons that Persig learnt from his biking and his looking after his bike. And the examples really are endless, right? You can grasp something crucial about your career in marketing through your love of gardening. You can end up a better parent because of your dedication also to playing the saxophone and the experiences you have doing improvisational jazz performances with your band. You can understand your architectural practice better through your cooking at home with your partner. Because, yeah, sometimes it's actually far easier to arrive at an insight that's crucial to this one domain of your life in a wholly different domain of your life. And if you focus your life largely on just one activity, you'll be cutting off so many potential sources of insight into that very activity. It's a little like, to give an analogy, how we're now carelessly wiping out loads of other species, but these species all have different biological systems, different immune systems, or healing systems, or defense systems, or energy conservation systems, or communication systems, or whatever, different ways of surviving and flourishing in this world we share with them, basically. And so by studying them closely, we can get so many ideas for, I don't know, medical and technological and infrastructural innovations that could really, really help us, could save us maybe in some circumstances. We could make a similar point about languages and indigenous cultures, perhaps, the wisdom contained in them. But no, we are not investing much effort in learning from these things, and we are instead carelessly wiping them out at an incredible rate. Now, finally, the third kind of connectedness I want to talk about, maybe there are more, maybe there are many more kinds, but three occurred to me when I was putting the presentation together. So the third kind I call background condition connectedness. Again, terrible terms, please forgive me. My basic point in speaking of this kind of connectedness overlaps a lot with a point I made earlier when talking about the dangers of a desperate desire to win or achieve. So it's just that whatever goal you're pursuing, that pursuit of yours is happening unavoidably in the broader context of your life. So the success of that pursuit is going to be dependent on not just the skill and effort that you bring to the pursuit, but also at least as much the background conditions of your life, which is to say that whatever you want to achieve in your life, your ability to achieve it is going to depend on, as well as your skill and effort, things like your mental and physical health, of course, and the support you have from friends, family, wider community, and the relationships you have in your field of activity, and we might add in adjoining fields, and the socio-economic infrastructure, the institutions that exist in your field of activity and how functional they are. And yeah, your general socioeconomic and indeed ecological circumstances, because like no matter what you want to achieve, it's likely to be a lot more difficult if a massive war breaks out or if the bubonic plague is busy wiping out half the world, or even just if the economy is nosediving and everyone is trying to spend as little money as possible. So you might have all the skill and determination you could possibly need, but if these other things don't align well enough, you're getting nowhere. And yeah, it only takes one. It only takes shortcomings in one of these 5 domains, and that could completely account for the difference between success and failure. So it's maybe important to be paying significant attention to these things too. I mean, handling them, or at least playing your part in handling them, doing your share of the work that's necessary there. And actually, to go a little bit further on just one of those points, you hear a lot of people who achieve wonderful things say, you know, I couldn't have done it without the support of my partner or my parents or a best friend, or whoever it may be. And just take them at their word there, right? I think that's totally plausible. And what that means is if you're spending all your time focusing on achieving your goal, and you don't, for instance, take some time out and go and meet someone and fall in love with them and develop a deep and rich relationship with them, then actually that could be the reason that you don't then eventually achieve your goal. Because when it gets to a certain decisive point, you won't have that support you need. Intellectual support, emotional support, moral support, you know, whatever kind of support. I recently heard the psychologist Barry Schwartz saying exactly this in a talk kind of surveying his very successful career. He was saying basically that all his great opportunities, all the great advantages and insights he's had have come to him by no design of his own. And the most that can be said for him is that he has recognized them for what they are when they've sort of landed in his lap. And the best example of that is Haha, his wife, who has been his most vital source of support, as well as his best critic and collaborator, reading and giving feedback on every single thing he writes for basically his whole career. And so, again, the best you can say for him is that he realized how wonderful she was when she turned up in his life, and realized what incredible good fortune he had when she seemed interested in him. But yeah, imagine if Barry Schwartz had never even met her, or but had never agreed to a date just because he was too busy cramming in the library the whole time, thinking his success as a psychologist would be essentially a function of how much he remained focused on his psychology studies. It's a tragic image, really, isn't it? Next up, fourth line of our mainstream productivity formula: be methodical, have a plan. And so the fourth thread of obliquity: planning versus muddling through. I take it that planning is trying in advance to optimize the process of achieving goals. And yeah, I'm going to argue that often, not always, planning can have exactly the opposite outcome. It can seriously hinder you in your attempts to achieve your goals. I mean, obviously, it's trivially true that if your goal is very easy and simple to achieve, there's probably not much point in coming up with a plan. It'll just slow you down. But that's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about how even if achieving the goal is necessarily going to be a complicated, drawn-out process, planning may just harm your prospects of achieving it. So that you often optimize the process of achieving your goals by not particularly trying to think out how to optimize those goals, and instead just getting on with trying to achieve them and kind of making the process up as you go along. Because, yeah, plans are, as it turns out, very dangerous things. Here are 6 ways in which I've experienced plans being dangerous. So first, plans can lead to a certain complacency, because you can feel, when you've come up with your plan, that you're kind of already there. You know, you've worked out how to do it, you've cracked it, as it were. Now all you've got to do is do it. You've just got to enact that plan you've already come up with. Or that's maybe over rationalizing what's actually more of an emotional impact. So it's maybe more like, as you plan, you imagine yourself taking all the steps you're thinking of. You imagine yourself overcoming the obstacles in the ways you're setting out in the plan. You imagine yourself getting to your goal. And yeah, when you're imagining those things, you kind of feel like you've done them. You're half celebrating already. You can see it already. It's right there. But it's not, of course. The plan is deluding you a little. Second, planning is a safe space, right? It can be very comfortable, the act of planning. You're not having to actually do anything, really. You're not having to take any big, scary risks. You're not having to deal with great exhaustion and pain. You're far from the jaws of defeat. You can get to really like it in the planning space and stay there way too long, until it's too late, really, for you to still be able to achieve what you wanted to achieve. Third, the planning fallacy, described by Kahneman and Tversky, apparently is just a normal feature of human nature that we tend to be quite insanely optimistic when we plan. We think we'll get things done way faster than we do, and we underestimate the risks and costs and overestimate the benefits. Even when we have lots of experience that should sober us up, it doesn't tend too much. This I very much identify with. If I honestly think I can get a piece of writing done in an hour, it's normally an afternoon. If I think a day, it's probably a week. If I think a week, God help me, we're probably talking years. And yeah, this cognitive bias means that we often, ironically, end up very underprepared, under-resourced, and disappointed. And then fourth, I think that in some cases, planning can have the exact opposite effect. I mean, dwelling on the obstacles we'll have to confront can make us lose hope and give up before we've even started trying. Whereas if we just threw ourselves into it without thinking too much, it would happen. And in the moment of the struggle, we'd somehow find a way. Um, and then, fifth problem with plans, planning can result in inflexibility to deal with or even properly perceive obstacles or opportunities that were not foreseen in the plan. You know, if you've got your plan and you prize the plan and you're thinking, just stay with the plan, stay with the plan is the way to get where we want to go. Something can come along, there's a great opportunity, but if you're just seeing the whole world through the plan and that's not in the plan, you're probably not even going to see the opportunity. Actually, micro example of this, just the other day, I was looking for the mop and bucket. I thought, maybe it's in the laundry room. And so I went to the laundry room and it wasn't there. And I was a bit confused. And on the way back from the laundry room, I realized that on my way there, I had walked right past the mop and bucket with it in plain view, right in front of me, well illuminated, etc. You know, no excuses at all. Quite a small space as well. I had just not seen it somehow. I guess as I was on autopilot in that moment on the way to the laundry room, as per the plan I had in my head. So yeah, plans invite autopiloting. Maybe that's a big part of the issue there. And finally, plans do not allow for the development of the goals themselves as the plans are enacted. And you can find yourself not just having to abandon the plan, but having to work against it, the grip it still has on you. If you've depended on a plan all along, put your faith in it, believed in it, you've likely also become invested in it, or you've maybe internalized it, and that's not necessarily easy to overcome. A plan that's being enacted can have a lot of practical and emotional momentum, in other words. And actually, of course, that's a problem not only if the goals change, but also if you just realize the plan was flawed, not going to work, or had too many negative externalities, to use a term that should straight away suggest some good examples here. So I'll conclude this discussion of the planning versus muddling through thread of obliquity with this famous Muhammad Ali quote: "Everyone's got a plan until they get punched in the face." I love this line, and two ways of interpreting it occur to me. One is that, it's all very well having a plan, but in the heat of the moment, when things are happening and you're having to react to them immediately, and maybe emotions and pain and shock are taking hold, you're very possibly not going to have the headspace to think at all of any plan you concocted in advance. And the other interpretation I can think of is that, sure, a plan might work very well for something that you can really know the nature of in advance. But if you're in a situation where you're dealing with other people who have their own objectives, and you really actually don't know how they're going to behave or respond to your actions, then plans become a lot more suspect, right? Because you might well have to chuck them out of the window immediately or just adapt them into oblivion. So, part 5 of our mainstream productivity formula: take full advantage of the assets you have. And our fifth thread of obliquity: advantage versus effort. Look at that image. This is, I think, the perfect image for this thread of obliquity. This is, of course, a reference to Aesop's fable about the race between the hare and the tortoise. The hare has a genuine inherent advantage, right? The hare is a lot faster than the tortoise. And the hare banks on this genuine inherent advantage, winning him the race. But there are other factors in play, even if they're less obvious. Relying on his speed, knowing he's so much faster, he's complacent. So he treats himself to a bit of a rest, oversleeps, and the tortoise wins the race. Now, imagine if the hare had, tied his legs together at the start of the race. Do you think it would have had the same outcome? Do you think the hair would still have had a rest midway through? Maybe very important to have in mind for this thread of obliquity is the pretty universal biological instinct to preserve energy where possible, which of course means that this sort of complacency effect I'm talking about, um, the complacency side effect of having an advantage, of having strength, is hardwired in us and will take conscious determination and or strong habituation to counteract. Now these are the OPEC countries, particularly the light blue ones. They're the core members and they alone control 80% of the world's proven oil reserves. And I want to say that they are at least somewhat like the hare in Aesop's fable. They have the equivalent of speed in the race. They have liquid gold. They have the resource most essential to the modern economy. So just take a moment, look at those countries, look at the list of names. What kind of countries are they? You'd think that they'd have huge advantages in pursuing all the goals of a state. Now, don't get me wrong, I realize geopolitics are a lot more complicated than the mythical tale of the race between the tortoise and the hare. There are many important factors in explaining conditions in these countries, historical factors going back long before oil was discovered there, neocolonial factors, arguably cultural and religious factors in some cases. But those factors, or at least some of them, could be exacerbated by the oil wealth. And in any case, they could have their harmful effects alongside the harmful effects of the oil wealth. Because, yeah, it seems to me clear that there are reasons to think significant oil wealth is likely to have serious negative effects on a country. And those negative effects are much discussed by scholars under the heading of the resource curse. The curse befalls not only countries with a lot of oil, but countries or places with any resource in particularly great abundance. Maybe the ultimate textbook example is actually the small Pacific island nation of Nauru, I think that's how you pronounce it, which was very rich in guano, i.e. accumulated bird droppings, basically. Guano has a lot of phosphate, potassium, and nitrogen in it, makes a very good fertilizer for use in farming. And yeah, Nauru got incredibly rich off it, and in the 60s and 70s had one of the highest GDPs per capita in the world, was importing Ferraris and Rolls Royces for use on its 21 square kilometers of territory, but then basically destroyed its entire habitat, desperately extracting every scrap of guano, and ended up dirt poor and borderline uninhabitable, and now subsists, I think, largely by hosting an Australian offshore refugee processing facility. So yeah, as many commentators have said, it's a good little warning for all of us. Human beings do this kind of thing to themselves. Anyway, there is plenty of debate on all sorts of elements of the resource curse, and of course every country's situation is unique, and there are obvious exceptions like Norway, but generally we can say that very resource-rich countries tend to have comparatively non-diversified and thus vulnerable economies. You know, they just rely a lot on getting their income from selling the resource, meaning they are very vulnerable to fluctuations in the market for that resource, and they can find themselves screwed if the resource runs out or the demand for it just dries up. Similarly, they tend to have comparatively low levels of education, limited human capital, same thing. They don't need to invest in their people. Their ruling regimes might even regard all that much education as a risk. And that is because very resource-rich countries tend also to be comparatively autocratic, as basically a regime can use the great wealth and geopolitical leverage that the resource gives it to increase its own power over the general population of the country. For similar reasons, they tend to have poor human rights records, as the regime does whatever it needs to shore up its power or treats its people poorly and capriciously just because it can, because of how powerful that regime is, thanks to its grip on the resource. And such countries tend to have quite a lot of corruption too, as different groups and individuals strive to get in on the action by whatever means, and then that corrupt behavior is normalized. And relatedly, very resource-rich countries tend to have comparatively high levels of foreign interference. Of course, the Americans are not going to let you be, neither these days are the Chinese, if you've got resources that they really need for their economy to function. And very resource-rich countries also tend to start wars more and cooperate less with other countries. Of course, the powerful don't need to cooperate, and the powerful can afford to start a fight. And yeah, the resource makes them powerful. Remember the famous Lord Acton quote, "Power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely." Why? Well, basically because our moral faculties need exercise. That's so important, I think. We don't inherently, unconditionally have our moral faculties. We often speak as if we do, but we really don't. They need exercise. And if we don't have any great power through which we can just get what we need and what we want, we're forced to exercise our moral faculties because, we need the freely given help of others to survive and get the things we want. So we need to cooperate with them, empathize with them, treat them well, be there for them in their difficulty, which of course is, in this scenario, typically similar to our own difficulty. So we know what it's like. If we're powerful, though, and we sort of live in a whole different reality and we don't need the help of others to survive and get the things we want. We certainly don't need it freely given to us. We just buy it from them, we just use or we extort it from them. We don't need to cooperate. And so we're not forced to exercise our moral faculties so much. And they get feeble, probably without us even noticing. And at the same time, we get addicted to the power because we know on some level that it is the source of our safety and comfort. And so we try and bolster and increase our power, typically at the expense of others, or maybe it's to the advantage of some particular others. And that is another part of what's corrupting us, because for those others, our power has become the gravy train or their source of their own security. And so they surround us and in all sorts of subtle and unsubtle ways try to get their claws into us and pressure us and lure us. And so they butter us up and schmooze us and prostrate themselves before us and just totally warp our sense of ourselves and of human relations. And they whisper in our ears that it's fine to do what we're doing to increase our power, that we're so wise, that it's all for the greater good, etc., etc. And that's why power corrupts, or something like that. That's a back of an envelope kind of sketch anyway. And yeah, large oil reserves, for instance, make you very rich, and being very rich means being very powerful. Here's another version of the resource curse. Okay, let's just go through it. So, very conventionally attractive people have tendencies. I repeat, tendencies. Maybe I should say, just all other things being equal, greater tendencies than most to first not invest so much effort in education or not develop other talents and capacities they have so much. But then also relatedly, to get objectified and not valued so much for deeper qualities they have. And as a lot of our self-conception can come from how others treat us, that experience of being constantly objectified by others can have knock-on effects for how they think of themselves and how they get used to conducting relationships with others. I think most of us are at least a little inclined to believe that we're on a deep level superior to most others. It's an inclination we need to work hard to counteract, I'd say. Now, if you're constantly getting the implicit or sometimes fairly explicit message from those around you that you're so much more worthy than others of love and attention and appreciation and so on, it's going to be so much more difficult for you to resist the belief that yes, you really are meaningfully, deeply superior to most of the people you're encountering, and so develop this really patronizing attitude to them, which will severely compromise all those relationships. For that kind of reason, I think it's easy for very conventionally attractive people to end up feeling very lonely, even if they're constantly surrounded by people. I mean, because both the way they are accustomed to looking at other people and the way other people tend to look at them are not actually conducive to human closeness or to healthy and deep relationships. And of course, this is particularly a problem because very conventionally attractive people tend to be pursued, sometimes aggressively, dishonestly, and manipulatively by a lot of people, including many horrible people, meaning, yeah, they can easily fall in with the wrong crowds. I mean, just think about this for a moment. It's a wonderful privilege that most of us have, the privilege of being left the fuck alone by horrible people simply because there's no particular reason why they take any interest in us. But that is not a privilege that very conventionally attractive people have. Think what a huge difference just one genuinely horrible person can make to your life if they really get into it. Now imagine legions of them are just endlessly making a beeline for you, putting on their very best masks as they do so. You wonder why the lives of hot young pop stars often go horribly wrong. I think that's a pretty big part of it. And then related to that, very conventionally attractive people are often intensively used, exploited, played as a card for the advantage of others. Because, yeah, the fat, bold, leering man in the office knows very well the power of those looks you have and knows that if he organizes things right, those looks will generate him a nice little income stream for the next few years. Or maybe you don't earn any money, you just become a trophy wife and sex toy for some big man, and your soul shrivels while he smilingly appropriates your existence for his pleasure and status. And a couple more obvious ones. Very conventionally attractive people are often idealized and therefore the victims of unrealistic expectations. I'm thinking especially of Japanese and Korean idol culture or the extremes of celebrity culture more generally. And very conventionally attractive people can also sometimes find themselves the victims of serious resentment, either from those who envy their looks or those who want them as sexual and romantic partners normally and can't have them. And I'm thinking now, especially of certain tendencies in incel subculture, for instance. And then perhaps giving that resentment a boost, very conventionally attractive people have tendencies to be less empathetic and alert to social injustice. And that's because doors have tended to be open for them. People have tended to turn smiling, obliging faces to them. And so they sort of instinctively assume it's much the same for others. So if those others are failing, it's probably their own fault. Or, I don't know, something like that. Definitely, I've read a few articles about studies of political attitudes indicating very conventionally good-looking people tend to be comparatively unmoved by issues of social justice. And I've met a few very conventionally good-looking people who seem fairly oblivious to the ways in which things that are easy for them are not nearly so easy for most other people. Like a let them eat cake kind of attitude. And yeah, finally, very conventionally attractive people often struggle more with the aging process, as for them, it can mean losing, even quite young and quite rapidly, the thing they've kind of lived by up to then. For most of us, the aging process is still tough, of course, but it doesn't have quite that sharp edge, at least not from such an early point on. Now, I don't mean to perpetuate stereotypes here. I can imagine that accusation being leveled at me. So, just to be clear, I'm not saying all very conventionally attractive people are describable in all or even necessarily any of these ways. Everyone has a unique nature, unique circumstances. There are often important countervailing forces too on many of these points. So, very conventionally attractive people are often extremely skilled and talented, for instance, no doubt helped by all of the doors that tend to be open for them. all the encouragement they tend to get, the world saying repeatedly yes to them. And, they're sometimes very empathetic and gloriously socially and emotionally intelligent, helped by having the confidence to put themselves in all sorts of social situations and maybe push those situations a bit further than others would, really speak to people, really be with people. And, as they enjoy how people respond to them, and then those people enjoy how they respond back, a kind of virtuous circle of closeness can emerge. So yeah, there's plenty such countervailing tendencies, and also there's a lot of variety within what are conventionally considered good looks, right? So some of those looks have very different effects from others. Some types of conventional good looks will tend to make people feel you're there for the taking. Other types will tend to make people feel they should run for their lives, etc., etc. It's complicated. I don't mean to make anything approaching absolute statements. I do mean to say that what I've listed here, are common traps for very conventionally attractive people. And I personally can't think of many very conventionally attractive people I've known who have, even for a time, successfully navigated all of them. So much so that these days, when I meet conventionally very attractive people, I often find myself thinking something like, yeah, nice, but that's probably going to be over before you know it, and I just hope it doesn't fuck you up too badly in the meantime. Also worth stressing again, conventional attractiveness is only an example here of a major resource, a genuine inherent advantage, as I've put it, that in many situations, or, in combination with many possible factors, can turn out more of a curse. Because in those cases, it can endanger and corrupt and enfeeble you. But I think you could make a similar list about intelligence or certain types of intelligence. Right now, it's slightly more opaque to me how certain types of intelligence can corrupt and enfeeble and endanger you, but I'm absolutely sure they can. I have a few thoughts on that, but it's something I need to consider a bit more. Or, yeah, monetary wealth or social status, or, of course, corporate or political power. Those would be the other major kinds of personal power, I think. Maybe charisma you could add to that list. Maybe energy or determination. I mean, of course, there are many, many more types of power, but most of them, like athletic skill these days, say, have pretty limited application in themselves. Like, they're not going to be able to, in themselves, secure you much of what you might want in this life, unless you can sort of translate them into monetary wealth or social status or whatever. Whereas conventional physical attractiveness, it's so interesting, right? Because it's, in some sense, such a trivial attribute. It doesn't mean much in some sense, almost nothing in some sense. Beauty is only skin deep, etc. And yet it's such a powerful force. Huge numbers of people will give a lot for its sake in many sorts of situations. Like, I often think with every new person that a very conventionally attractive person meets, they kind of have to wonder, and how much power can my looks give me over you? And every now and again, they will meet someone whom their looks give them almost unlimited power over. Like, that person will give everything they own. They'll give their lives or the lives of others to win their favor or be with them. Athletic skill can't do that. Political influence can't do that. The face that launched 1,000 ships is how Marlowe famously described Helen of Troy, and all on the basis of, nothing really, of a carnival mask, as Elena Ferrante puts it. Yeah, so a deeply cursed kind of power, it seems to me, at least often. And important to note, perhaps, I've spoken of conventional extreme attractiveness here. If I was speaking of just attractiveness, it would be a whole different conversation. Attractiveness is, I'd say, far more various in nature, uh, far more subjective in one important sense, far more objective in another, perhaps. Often, at least, far more meaningful. But yeah, still sometimes cursed, I guess. So, An underlying point in those two discussions there of different types of resource curse is that our strengths can contain in them the seeds of our destruction. Our strengths can contain in them great vulnerabilities. And not least, David Foster Wallace now points out in this passage, in the effect they have on our self-esteem, how we come to value ourselves and the lives we live. So I won't read out the text. It's quite long. I'd encourage you to go check out the talk that the passage comes from. But just think, the world is full of innumerable things we could love and value and care about and live for, but then we get incredibly selective. Maybe we are always, in a sense, selective, but we get incredibly selective in a rigid way about what we value and what we're living for. And it often is on the basis of what we feel or get the message that we're good at. So take tennis, for example. David Foster Wallace was a big tennis guy, and this is kind of a point that's there somewhere in his novel Infinite Jest. So maybe you're good at tennis as a kid and very good as a young teenager, and then by the time you're 25, you're a major pro, and playing tennis and winning at tennis is like 60%, 70%, maybe 80% what you care about in this world. And you value yourself first and foremost as a great tennis player. A tennis player who's going to end up in the history books. Like, you derive your self-esteem first and foremost from that. And eventually you have to stop. You're 35, you've been going downhill for a while, you can't do it anymore, and then your life feels kind of empty, or at least it's a pale reflection of what it was before. And maybe you'll never recover from that. You'll always feel like a has-been, living a dull life, reminiscing about the old glory days. This is a familiar stereotype, right? But I think we don't see enough what an absolute tragedy it is that you've become unable to value anything like as much as you could have so many of the other wonderful things in the world and in yourself. Your evaluation has narrowed down on this tiny little part of you and of the world. And that's all really just because you were very good at tennis in your teens. And that skill gave you a very particular life journey to go on, a very particular set of situations to live through. And that life journey, those situations shaped your mind, shaped your attention and capacity to value. And it all made you smaller, a smaller thing. It seems to me a tragedy that we just don't talk about much, and that in different forms befalls most people. So watch the wonderful Pixar film Soul if you want a more fleshed out illustration here, with the role of tennis player replaced with that of jazz pianist in that case. Both tennis and jazz are pretty specific examples, of course. Wallace here is talking about far broader things we start to measure our world by, start to worship in his terms, like, our own beauty or sexual allure, our power, our intelligence. Again, it's the things that give us our strength, especially these ones with very broad application. But they so easily end in tragedy because our powers start influencing how we experience the world, what we do, what we don't do, what we think, what we focus on, how we approach situations, how we evaluate things, how we evaluate ourselves. Kind of like, that saying, if you have a hammer, everything is a nail. But then it's like at the same time, all the nails you see everywhere reinforce your hammeriness. And then what do you do when a bit later you encounter things that are just unambiguously not in any way nails? Or when your hammer starts to rust and disintegrate, or when there's a bigger, better hammer that appears next to you. So again, it's this idea of our strengths serving us up these profound existential traps. So this poem, I think I first read it in secondary school. It's really stuck in my head though. Larkin wrote this for the newly born daughter of his good friend Kingsley Amis, and he's basically saying what he wishes for her. in her life. And it's really the second stanza here that stands out in the memory, at least for me. May you be ordinary, have like other women an average of talents, not ugly, not good looking, nothing uncustomary to pull you off your balance. The unworkable itself stops all the rest from working. In fact, may you be dull, if that is what a skilled, vigilant, flexible, unemphasized, enthralled catching of happiness is called. So this idea of balance, again, very crucial here. A great strength, like a great weakness, can pull you off your balance, Larkin says. I think it's important to note that it needn't. Larkin doesn't equate balance with averageness and dullness. That's not our existential predicament, thank God. In the first stanza, he says, sure, if you can be beautiful, great, you're a lucky girl. And I take it he means there unproblematically beautiful, workably beautiful, to use his term. So, no, he just acknowledges this threat, this risk of our strengths unbalancing us. And actually, it makes me think also of how, and this might just be something else now, there are cases of football teams like consistently playing better when the player who's clearly their best player is absent, injured or suspended. And I remember a film director, I think it was Darren Aronofsky, saying that you haven't finished editing your film until you've removed the shot you feel is the best shot in the film. And I guess the thought, or one of the thoughts behind that, is that, if you really appreciate the quality of a particular shot, you can end up distorting the overall film in order to try and accommodate it. And similarly, your football team might alter the way it plays to accommodate its best player and might actually play worse overall in consequence. Or if, of course, it could also be that you just usually play with your best player, and so the opposition have prepared for the game by studying how you play when your best player is present. And now that you're not playing with your best player, you're actually playing a different way from what they were ready for, and so it throws them. Yeah, like an unintended positive side effect of playing without your best player could be healthy tactical variation in some cases. Or it could be that your best player is actually an egotistic dickhead and the others just hate playing with him. Or it could be that they like him, but they just, consciously or not, collectively take it a bit easier when the best player is there, as they assume he'll do the work, he'll make the difference. And with that last possibility, could plausibly be something similar going on in the film case. You're relying too much on that one great shot to make the difference, have the impact. Although also in the film case, it could be crucial that a film is not just a succession of shots, meaning the qualities of a shot and the qualities of a film are not necessarily the same in nature, and they're not necessarily always compatible either. So the great shot may be great as a shot, but not as a moment in a film, or not this one anyway. I mean, it may be just a distractingly beautiful shot, say, like the beauty of that shot just doesn't fit emotionally in the scene. So if you keep it there, it really disrupts the emotional experience of that scene. Anyway, this is, I hope, a useful little deviation, perhaps. Diversion, I should say. Deviation is the French word that we use in Luxembourg. Perhaps, yeah, I hope it's a useful little deviation, because it illustrates how there may be quite a lot of ways in which a strength can unbalance the system or the country or person it belongs to. Up to now, I've focused mostly on over-reliance and consequent complacency, as in the tortoise and the hare case, and then also on like outside reactions to the strength. But you could have a case where you really don't over-rely on your strength, but you just very much want to fit it in somewhere in a given situation or a given role you have. Like, of course you do, it's your great strength. But to fit it in, you have to alter your overall engagement with that situation or playing of that role. And that means you don't overall do nearly as good a job as you could have. Like, say you're a cricket batsman and you have an amazing reverse sweep, like the best in the game. The crowd goes wild when you do your reverse sweep. And now you go into a match where you certainly don't have any intention of like relying on your reverse sweep, hitting every ball or even most balls with a reverse sweep. You know that would never work. But seeing you're so damn good at the reverse sweep and the crowd love it so much, you would like to use it when you get the opportunity, when the time is right, when it's the right type of ball you've been bowled. And the consequence of that is that you're kind of constantly on the lookout for such an opportunity. Like your body and brain are always just a little primed for that reverse sweep opportunity you want. And maybe that means you're a little less psychologically and physically ready for all the other kinds of shots you might need to play. And so you end up playing worse overall just because of how great you are at the reverse sweep. So that, like, in an individual player, the equivalent of the team playing differently and therefore worse just to accommodate the star player is something like that. And even when I mention that possibility of the other players actually hating the star player because he's an egotistic dickhead, I actually think there could be a version of that at the individual level. So first thought there would be, well, Jordan Peterson, in a lecture on psychopathology that he gave before he was famous, it's on YouTube somewhere, said that an addiction functions a lot like a malign, obsessive personality within our larger personality that can periodically just take control of us. He said that kind of archaic way of thinking of addiction is in a way richer and more accurate than any more scientific description. So the second thought, great strength has an affinity with addiction, or it can easily end up having an addictive element, because your great strength can be what you endlessly resort to get your buzz or to feel okay. So putting those two thoughts together now, it may perhaps be that for some people, their great strength can start to take on the form of a whole separate personality within them, or start to feel that way. Like, it would be fascinating to study the relationships between great artists and their stage personas, whether they think of themselves as having stage personas or not. I think of Asif Kapadia's biopic documentaries, and especially the one on Diego Maradona, which has this recurring observation that Diego, the man known to friends and family, was very different from Maradona, the football god. And I feel like I've seen it in a lot of other contexts too. And it's not just that very talented people can come to have this sort of alter ego that builds up around their talent, but they have a tendency, especially with time, to hate that alter ego, right? So there ends up being this kind of Jekyll and Hyde dynamic, or even this Bruce Banner and Hulk dynamic, which now makes me think about like David Bowie and how he had this tradition of continually inventing new alter egos, Ziggy Stardust, the Thin White Duke, etc., and then killing them off every few years and inventing new ones, which was maybe profoundly wise or just an act of great meaning rather than a kind of stunt, as it was, I guess, normally understood. But yeah, I think sometimes we self-sabotage in parts of our own lives because we kind of hate the version of ourselves that manifests in those parts. And maybe that's because, yeah, that version of us went to town on being particularly good at something and is now an egotistic dickhead. Anyway, the bigger point is that yes, there are probably quite a few ways in which a great strength can unbalance you. But like Larkin, I don't think that a great strength will necessarily and unavoidably unbalance you. I think that depends on the other factors in your life, including perhaps your balancing skill and knowledge and instinct, and certainly many features of your context. So a very big question here is what is a balanced life? Dietitians say we should have a balanced diet. We also speak about work-life balance. But I think we also need to speak more generally about having a balanced life, which involves far more than just not working too much. And yeah, just as the precise meaning of a balanced diet will vary from one person to another, the precise meaning of a balanced life will too, I think. Still, surely we can speak of some fairly standard elements. I'm going to have a go, of course. I'd say a strong, pretty close network of family and long-term friends and community is normally crucial. These are people who perceive us in ways that are more complex and, for instance, not overwhelmingly based on any great strength we have and any mythos surrounding it. Think of like George Harrison talking about Lennon and McCartney as just, these random idiots he grew up with in Liverpool. More specifically, I think a well-balanced life involves some presence of children and elders, of other animals, of the natural world. All these elements put things in important perspective in different ways. I know J.D. Vance recently got lambasted for his complaint about, was it childless cat ladies? I don't know the details of what he said, but that apparently derogatory and sexist term suggests to me that the lambasting was probably quite justified. Still, I defend the idea that there's at least a kernel of truth in what he was saying. Having kids around can, I think, make us, on an instinctive level, a little more in tune with the basics of the human enterprise, so to speak, and a little less easily consumed by shallow projects of self-promotion, say. And yeah, I also believe another element of a balanced life, we should not be inordinately wealthier than our peers, never needing freely given help from them, able to play God with our money in their lives or the life of anyone. That is some seriously unbalanced shit right there, it seems to me. We probably need to stay quite active too. I mean, not just physically, but also morally, intellectually, meditatively, emotionally active. All this stuff in different ways needs exercising to retain the balance. So you have a strength, great, but don't underestimate the value of the rest of the system. The potential, the vulnerability, the crucialness to you as a whole that is vested throughout all the other parts of the system that you are. It's often said, and maybe it's in some poetic sense true, that we only use 12% or whatever it is of our brain. And I wonder if that's in part because we think that 12% is the best bit. But even if it is, the bigger point is surely that we're not using 78%, right? So yeah, we need to get exercising these neglected parts of ourselves. So we should have ideally many different sorts of activities in our day-to-day lives, appealing to many different parts of us, multiple jobs perhaps, or at least diverse tasks within our jobs, all sorts of personal life commitments and hobbies and fascinations, and we should rest, and I'd even say laze a lot, and we should keep learning, often lazily, keep experiencing progress in ourselves, and keep introducing ourselves to new areas of wonder, keep alive our ability to value diverse things. That's a balanced life, right? But sure, it's very hard to achieve, especially under ordinary conditions of life. And especially if, when you have a talent, you and your society collude to create for you a whole themed little world around that talent and largely encage you there, where even your loved ones typically can't really deeply enter. I don't have much hope for a balanced life being retained in that kind of case. Though, yeah, you might have some money or other kinds of power that you can put to use in addressing, or at least somewhat mitigating, the resulting problems of imbalance. And granted, as we age, we lose abilities, and that unbalances us. And that, for now, and perhaps for better, can't be helped particularly. But we unbalance ourselves and diminish or destroy ourselves prematurely. That's clear. That's, I'd say, the norm. With many destroyed people walking around appearing quite fine. The global factory of wasted humans is, I think, Sigmund Bauman's term that is impossible to forget for me, having once heard it. I say all this in praise of balance. I do acknowledge that we get a lot of good stuff out of moments of imbalance. And, some of the best moments of our lives are moments of severe imbalance. I think of Nick Hornby talking about how the most intensely joyous moments of his life came out of his completely unbalanced, unhealthy football fanaticism. I think also of very irrational, unhealthy, even totally delusional romantic episodes. Maybe higher level balance or higher order balance involved a fair bit of lower order imbalance, or we can say that even balance is something we should pursue in a balanced way. Even proportionality is something we should want in proportion. Anyway, Larkin there was making a case for being average, shockingly. And before that, we had a case against being strong. The case against being weak is one that hardly needs making, I would have thought. But you can also make a case for being weak in some ways. So here's a list of some of the more resource-poor countries in the world. Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, Switzerland, Belgium, Japan. You see the point, though maybe it's not the strongest one. I'm not sure how cherry-picked those examples are, all told. Anyway, you also often hear this idea that apparent major weaknesses can have as flip sides major strengths, whether that's the blind person with extraordinary hearing, or like the writer Borges, an extraordinary internal eye, an extraordinary imagination, or whether it's the proverbial fat guy who's learnt to be very funny as a social or mating strategy, or whether it's Bill Gates, whose social anxiety caused him to focus so much on his computer work, which is, of course, what his great success came out of. I also think of this Edgar Carrot story, Pipelines, in which a teacher is described as saying that the first human being in prehistoric times to use a club was not the strongest and not the smartest. They didn't need a club. The first human being to use a club was someone who didn't have either of those advantages and needed to find a way to compete with them. Not sure on what level, if any, that's true, but you get the idea, right? If necessity is the mother of invention, and I think it's certainly one of them, then a bit of necessity is a very useful thing. And so something that gives you necessity can be a kind of blessing, if often a disguised one. In any case, I do think that some very good advice is if you see someone with some major weakness, be on the lookout for the corresponding major strength. And if you see someone with some major strength or power, be on the lookout for the corresponding weakness. It might be hidden, it probably will be. It might take an unexpected form, but it will be there probably. And another kind of example that occurs to me, actually, a slightly different kind. Sometimes knowing nothing or very little about a particular topic is precisely what enables you to bring something new to the discussion of that topic, because compared to the experts, you're not weighed down by certain preconceptions. You're not caught up in established ways of thinking on that topic. You have a radically different perspective from them, and especially if that's based on a bit of good sense and intelligence and maybe insights from other areas of life, then sometimes, just sometimes, you can be better placed to make a breakthrough than the seasoned experts. So that's a clear way in which a weakness, ignorance, can play out as a strength. And maybe it's a little similar to how, you have young people who maybe love a few specific bands but have pretty limited knowledge of music, will come along and make music that is genuinely new and exciting. Well, older musicians who know like their whole musical tradition inside out will just keep making stuff that sounds the same. But yeah, I grant there could be other factors in that, and maybe it's not particularly representative, that scenario I've just described. Older people often make great music too, and I grant a couple of specific detailed examples would be good here. But I think this kind of stuff happens, doesn't it? I mean, like Emperor's New Clothes is like a moral equivalent. The kid hasn't yet learnt adult manners, apparently, including how and why to bullshit, so he tells the truth, the in some sense crucial truth, by default, shattering the whole ridiculous paradigm of the beautiful invisible costume. Um, Maybe the point there is that learning can be polluted. I mean, both moral learning and factual learning can be polluted, compromised, false in effect. So not having much learning, while that's a weakness in many ways, can also be a strength in some, because then you're free of those polluted, compromised, false bits of learning too. And maybe one of the main types of knowledge that's most easily polluted is knowledge of limitations. You often hear it said that people who do amazing new things in any given field are young people new to the field who don't yet know that it's impossible to do those things. And maybe another kind of easily polluted knowledge is just like excessive theory interposing between instinct and expression. Uh, anyway, another fascinating type of example, there's this theory of depressive realism, according to which, in some ways at least, we actually see the world more accurately when we're depressed. Now, I kind of love that idea and kind of hate it. I guess the core point there is that to be a well-functioning, reasonably calm, reasonably happy person just involves certain necessary delusions. And even though they're necessary, they can cost sometimes, of course. So then I wonder if that's true, is something similar true of other systems? That sometimes they function well only on the basis of what are, in other important senses, weaknesses or errors. I mean, certainly I can think of many systems that function well on the basis of severe vulnerabilities. And I'm thinking here about, as much as anything economic or political, the likes of Martha Nussbaum and Brene Brown talking about a well-lived life and the role of vulnerability in that. But yeah, putting it really simply, what is good and what is bad is so much more changeable from one scenario to another than we tend to appreciate, I think. I've spoken of weaknesses being strengths here. Of course, if we speak about a clearly related phenomenon, isolated, terrible experiences being the basis of great success, that's an even longer list of obvious examples, right? That's very much a familiar trope of biography and autobiography, and that leads on to now, avoid any unforced errors, the final line of our mainstream productivity formula. And so the final thread of obliquity that I'm going to discuss, perfectionism versus flawed glory. And yeah, here I basically want to challenge the idea that avoiding error and failure where possible in the pursuit of your goals will necessarily help you achieve them. Now, this is in some sense obvious, right? It's something that certainly these days business gurus go on and on about. So I will briefly mention that obvious sense, but then I'll dedicate a bit more time to another less obvious sense there is to this. So the obvious sense, yeah, the I hope now infamous one-time internal motto of Facebook, move fast and break things, has behind it this logic, right? All progress is achieved through trial and error, and the only way you cut out the error is by cutting out the trial. So you then also cut out the progress. Is that strictly true, what I've just said? Well, no, I suppose in some cases you can have trial and no error. You can just strike gold straight away, flukishly. And in some cases, the breakthrough just sort of lands in your lap, as per Barry Schwartz. But generally in life, you've got to experiment to learn. And if you're not going to risk error, you can't really experiment, or not much. Comes back to a point that I discussed as part of the first thread of obliquity. The Edison quote here, or at least paraphrase, I couldn't find the original quote, curiously. Anyway, it's a classic, isn't it? And rightly so. I have not failed to invent the light bulb. I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work. Also worth saying, the image is not of like opening thousands of boxes and not finding in them what you're looking for, and therefore knowing at least that those boxes don't contain what you're looking for. No, those failures give far richer information than that. Edison was learning through his failed prototypes that this does this and that has that effect, and in these conditions this responds like that. So the empty boxes, if we're going to stick with that metaphor, have clues in them about what the box that actually contains what you're looking for is like, or where it's located, or at least many of them do. And there's also a point about speed, I think. Like, sure, it might in theory have been possible for Edison to work out how to make a light bulb without himself experimenting, just by sort of endlessly combing over and thinking through information that he already had at his disposal. I mean, information in large part from experiments others had done in the past. But that would probably have taken so long. I mean, even if it were possible, and been so difficult compared to just doing a few experiments and getting some fresh information. So sometimes trying, even when you know you're all but certain to fail, is the best policy, because it gets you information quickly, or it gets you practice, which maybe we could describe in informational terms. Anyway, in the move fast and break things motto, the instruction is literally to break things. Of course, there is always the question of the cost of failure, the cost of the breaking. And in social media's case, the breaking was, teen suicides and Cambridge Analytica and so on and so forth. Now, a perhaps less obvious angle on this thread of obliquity, it's, in my impression, really not widely observed. I mean, it's not part of how we tend to speak, but something can be better than perfect. And that's because perfection, insofar as that concept makes sense, must mean something like completely achieving all of its goals without drawbacks. I mean, what else could it mean? So assuming it does mean that, it follows that a less ambitious project is more easily perfect than a more ambitious project. The fewer goals a project has and the less challenging those goals are, the more easily it achieves them all without drawbacks. There is this trade-off, in other words, between ambitiousness and perfectibility. And that means that a very, very ambitious project can be thoroughly flawed, but still overall a far greater thing than a less ambitious but entirely perfect project. When you speak about the perfection of an artwork, for instance, that's a far more complicated matter than the perfection of, a gardening tool, because the goals of artworks can be very diverse and changeable and determined by audience members and their current mentalities as much as by anything the artists themselves intend. And actually, you could have two interpretations of the same artwork, one according to which it's more ambitious but imperfect, and the other according to which it's less ambitious but absolutely perfect. Or that's my thinking on this anyway. So those were 2 points about how being willing to risk being wrong can help us achieve our goals sometimes. Now I want to make 2 points about how actually being wrong can help us achieve our goals sometimes. The first here, flagged up by Edward de Bono in his book on lateral thinking. or, well, one of his many books on lateral thinking. He says basically that sometimes having a wrong idea can be what gets you into a position in which you can see the way forward to a right idea. And indeed, one way in which he defines lateral thinking is as developing a rich variety of ideas rather than any one idea that is strictly right. De Bono, at least in the bit of text which I got this quote from, gives the example of Marconi, who initially thought radio waves would follow the curvature of the Earth. They didn't, but somehow that idea still really helped him in the right direction. I think of how sometimes I write things, essays or stories, which are shit. They're just shit. They're poorly conceived right from the start, and eventually I realize this, and I usually abandon them at that point. They were never going to amount to anything in themselves. However, in working on them, a small idea comes up, some small detail in the argument I was making or the story I was telling, and that idea proves the basis of work that really is good. And it's doubtful I would have had that good idea if I hadn't spent ages on that really bad idea. Or another big example, perhaps, Columbus was convinced he'd sail the other way around the world and get to the Orient that way and establish a lucrative trade route to the Orient. Well, that didn't work out for him at all. But he discovered, at least from a European perspective, a whole new continent, and that wasn't just luck, right? He had the rare idea that the world was round, and so there must be something over there. It's not just a void, a precipice. And he staked a lot on this, and he was right about that, just not in the way he imagined. So yeah, an error can often prove to have, one way or another, a lot of rightness in it. And then the second way in which actually being wrong, even seriously wrong, and failing terribly can help us achieve our goals is through the emotional and mental impact of that experience. Basically, we tend to think more and learn more and remember better when we are in negative emotional states, which of course failing tends to put us in. So it can easily be the case that if you just have steady success all the way up to the final approach of your goal, the final hurdles, you may not achieve it. Whereas if you had failed humiliatingly and disastrously once or twice or a few times on the way, you might have thought and learned more, and so you'd have been in a position to get over those final hurdles. You'd have the necessary insight or mental emotional resources. Although just thinking about this now, it's quite funny that, like, suppose you know this, what I've just described to you, then you'd probably be less disturbed by failure, right? Though perhaps if you were less disturbed by failure, you'd learn less because your learning was contingent on negative emotional state that you're in. So I'm sorry I've told you that, but I have now told you that. Moving on. Some thinkers have gone further and thought that really all deep thinking and all important spiritual growth, or maybe even all meaning, comes from suffering. Proust, I think, thought something along those lines. Jordan Peterson also sometimes says things that sound like that. I don't take that more extreme kind of view myself, but I'm interested by the idea. I would like to hear more about it. I feel it's an idea that might grow on me as I get older. And sorry, by the way, I know it would have been great to have provided citations like this throughout and include a proper bibliography. I was not organized or invested enough for that. I'm not paid for any of this. If you especially want a precise source, let me know and I'll try and dig it up for you. This bit here I was just able to lift basically from a paper I read recently on the usefulness of boredom by Andreas Elpidoru, and actually another Mediterranean-sounding name, equally difficult to pronounce, Dimitris Zygalatas. I watched a great talk by him recently on the usefulness of extremely painful social rituals that some groups, or particularly indigenous tribes, practice. Very worth considering alongside this stuff, I'd guess. So one more time, here's that mainstream productivity formula. I have kind of decimated it, haven't I? I haven't decimated it, though. I've just provided a bit of balance, I hope. I've stated the other sides of the argument. And yeah, here's another kind of summary of what I've just talked through. And to repeat, I really don't mean to say that, it's never helpful to plan, or never helpful to specialize, or never helpful to really, really want something, or never helpful to avoid errors, or never helpful to have a contentless end goal, even. I'm sure a lot of people have gone and done great things from the starting point of, I want to make the world a better place. You start something and then you get into it, and the contentful now goals naturally emerge in you. That can happen, sure. So no, my concern is not that these obvious approaches to life and to getting somewhere exist. My concern is more that people resort to them so indiscriminately and zealously. Now, to try and get what I've been saying back into some kind of shape, I'd like to take a moment to put all these different threads of obliquity in proper obliquity terms, insofar as I can, because I think I strayed a bit there from talking in obliquity terms. So remember, obliquity is when you're more likely to achieve a goal when you're trying to do something else. So first, you're often more likely to win the game if you're instead motivated more by just the joy of playing the game. Second, you're often more likely to achieve your contentless end goal when instead focusing on your contentful now goal. Third, you're often more likely to achieve your goal if you instead are, a lot of the time, trying to do completely different things that are not even in any obvious way part of the process of trying to achieve this central goal. Fourth, you're often more likely to optimize your pursuit of a goal if you instead don't try to optimize it. I mean, don't plan and don't try to control the process too much. Just go for it. Fifth, you're often more likely to have practically an advantage in achieving your goals if you actually don't have any inherent advantage in achieving your goals, or even if you have an inherent disadvantage. And sixth, you're often more likely to achieve your goal if you instead are actually failing in your attempts to get closer to it quite a lot of the time. I don't know, I feel I am stretching that concept of obliquity with a few of those, kind of making it fit. But, well, in my defense, it is difficult delineating your concepts, putting them all in a schema. I mean, if you're trying to discuss something a little bit new, and yeah, I hope you'll at least agree it's all interesting, it's all related, it all fits in quite well under this banner of the poetry of productivity. It's an ambitious rather than by any means perfect presentation, let's say. I'm practicing what I preach. Anyway, sticking with this schema of obliquity for just a moment more, how about we ask the question, is there a common basis to all of this obliquity? And if so, what is it? Well, I think there is. I think we just don't understand the mechanics of ourselves or of the universe nearly as well as we think we do and feel we do. So what looks to us like directly pursuing something is often just not. I came across this quote recently from G.K. Chesterton's book, Orthodoxy, a book I've not read but would like to. The real trouble, he says, with this world of ours is not that it is an unreasonable world, nor even that it is a reasonable one. The commonest kind of trouble is that it is nearly reasonable, but not quite. Life is not an illogicality, yet it is a trap for logicians. It looks just a little more mathematical and regular than it is. Its exactitude is obvious, but its inexactitude is hidden. its wildness lies in wait. Isn't that lovely? I guess, I don't know if the world itself uh, is a trap for logicians and only semi-logical, but certainly our firmly established and even natural ways of thinking about it and perceiving it are. Just to give one really clear example, or one more really clear example, uh, words and therefore presumably concepts for precise numbers beyond 5 or 6 have not existed in all cultures historically. I think there are even some small tribes where that's still the case today. Um, so uh, people in those cultures or in those tribes, they can count up to 6 or whatever, and then beyond that, they can only say a lot or an enormous amount or something like that. Uh, but then if you don't have precise numbers beyond 6, try inventing computers. Try having a monetary economy. Try building atomic reactors or spaceships. Uh, and we can reasonably ask, like, okay, we have all these big numbers now, but what words and concepts are equivalent for us to precise numbers beyond about 6 for those historical cultures? I.e., what words and concepts are we still lacking such that we are radically constrained in our thinking and incapable of accessing whole vistas of civilizational development? We can also reasonably ask, by the way, what might we have lost in becoming so fixated on numbers as we have? And yeah, numbers track reality in some important ways, of course, but uh, maybe they misrepresent it in others. That's certainly suggested by Zeno's tortoise, the paradox of Zeno's tortoise, for instance. There's this great word that I remember first coming across in school when studying ancient Greek and Shakespearean tragedies, but that does get used more widely. The word is hubris, which describes the personality trait of excessive self-confidence leading to a downfall. We do seem, and many people have said this, a hubristic species. And I don't know, maybe there's not such a thing as a non-hubristic species. That's a question I'd love answers to, in fact. And yeah, very possibly we're in some important ways more hubristic now than we were historically before this sort of rapid technological and scientific progress that we've had in the last 300 years or so. But a certain hubris does seem quite central to our very nature. So I very often think of these words from Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. It's where he's trying to explain his concept of Wysiati, or I think he says Weesiati, which is an acronym for what you see is all there is, which he describes as, a central sort of tenet of how we think, how we perceive, how we judge. Yeah, he says our brains are radically insensitive to both the quality and the quantity of the information that gives rise to impressions and intuitions. It's shocking to think, but then I take a step back and I realize, yeah, it's true of me, and it seems to be true of everyone else. We just get so confident of certain conclusions based on almost nothing in the scheme of things. If you're a certain kind of person and I tell you this guy's a Trump voter, I'm not saying you know nothing about someone on the basis of the fact they've voted for Trump, but I am saying you probably think you know a hell of a lot more than you actually do. Being very aware of that inherent weakness in our nature, that vulnerability in our nature, it strikes me as so important. And I'd say this whole book, Thinking Fast and Slow, and Kahneman's work generally, and work in the field of behavioral science generally, is really crucial to both understanding and properly engaging with the poetry of productivity, as I've called it. And thinking of that term, Wysiati, I wonder if there could be a kind of language or way of speaking that could make all of what I've said here, I mean, all of the sensible bits, completely obvious. Like, could there be everyday words and phrases and lines that just perfectly capture and foreground these kinds of counter thoughts I've articulated? I suppose I'm thinking language conventions can be, among other things, a kind of counterbalance to impulses and intuitions and biases, but then maybe changing our language in that way would inevitably involve other important things currently tracked by our language slipping from our view. I don't know, just another inadequately explored thought tangent. I think that's probably a bit defeatist, what I just said at the end there. And I know, yeah, like this was, in coming up with terms like Wysiati, this was very much Kahneman's aim, that the term would enter daily discourse and be a kind of resource that we all have to keep our deep-seated biases and vulnerabilities of judgment in check. So yeah, if there's a methodological response to problems of obliquity and the poetic nature of productivity, I think behavioral science is one important part of that. I think another is maybe something like the psychoanalytic tradition that interrogates and has some skepticism about our true intentions, where they come from, and then maybe a kind of biological, anthropological project that tries to establish what are, at least close to fundamental universal human needs and goods, and what's more adaptable or variable in our needs and goods. And then maybe also the Aristotelian tradition of ethics with its emphasis on balance, maybe some sort of more spiritual, religious traditions which have such an emphasis would be very helpful to consult here too. And then, yeah, I suspect another very important part is this discipline of systems thinking. So systems thinkers say we have a strong tendency, perhaps especially since the time of the Industrial Revolution, to think in this very linear fashion where we see a problem and then we just want to identify a cause and a solution. So for instance, we have a skin problem, so we diagnose it and put the relevant cream on. End of. And, similar things are going on in the way we conduct our economic life, or the way we try and deal with major social problems like addiction, and so on and so forth. But the thing is that, going back to the skin example, probably that skin cream we used actually only treats the symptoms rather than the underlying causes of the skin problem. And what's worse, maybe the cream, while treating the symptoms, actually subtly damages the skin in other ways, leaves it more vulnerable to other problems, or a worsening of the same problem longer term. And maybe the better approach would be to actually look at the specific internal processes playing into the original skin problem and how those relate to lifestyle, environment, diet, etc. So yeah, systems thinkers emphasize the importance of, and then schematize, this far more holistic understanding of the situation, and rail against that linear or event-based, as they sometimes also say, style of thinking, which they see absolutely everywhere in our daily life, from news coverage of current events to government social and economic policy to personal efforts at self-improvement. Literally everywhere, really. Their complaint is that it's a pervasive oversimplification in our thinking. So I love this Garrett Hardin quote. When we think in terms of systems, we see that a fundamental misconception is embedded in the popular term side effect, a term I've used throughout here. This phrase means roughly effects which I hadn't foreseen or don't want to think about. So side effects no more deserve the adjective side than does the principal effect. It is hard to think in terms of systems, and we eagerly warp our language to protect ourselves from the necessity of doing so. So yeah, coming back to language there, as just discussed on the previous slide. However, worth saying, even Meadows ends with an appeal to appreciate the limitations of systems thinking. She has this great notion, don't try to gain complete eternal control of the system, she says. Just learn to dance with it. And I take it that invoking dance there relates to my invoking of poetry. By the way, I read this book, Thinking in Systems, only recently. In fact, when I was already in the process of trying to put all this stuff together. And in fact, this was, I think, the only book I read with a project like this presentation actually in mind, which is to say, this presentation is very much a product of Obliquity too. I never set out to research it. I just, over many years, noticed patterns in very diverse things I was reading for very diverse reasons. And then when thinking about what I could contribute to an economics summer school on the theme of productivity, it all just started coming out. And yeah, I'd heard of Meadows' work and I thought it might be very relevant. So I read it and absolutely loved it. Underlined almost every sentence, one of those. Both the Hardin and the Chesterton quotes just used are from it. And I wonder whether if I'd read it years ago, this whole presentation, I mean, assuming I would have ended up doing such a presentation, would have been framed in its terms rather than in the terms of Obliquity. Because yeah, it was Kay's book, Obliquity, that I came across and read, I don't know, 6, maybe 7 years ago. And it probably started me thinking along these lines. But as I said, I feel I'm straining that concept, whereas maybe systems thinking could fit the whole discussion within it more easily. And one other connection I want to make here, Ian McGilchrist's account of how the detail-focused left hemisphere has become dominant in the West and then throughout the world at the expense of the holistic right brain hemisphere. I've not actually read McGilchrist, but I've listened to him lecture a few times, and I sense that that whole brain hemisphere discussion of his would tie in neatly with a lot of this stuff. Because, yeah, if I understand rightly, McGilchrist is very much a hedgehog thinker, as Isaiah Berlin would put it. And he surveys in his books the whole history of humanity and sort of redescribes it as a journey of changing relations between the brain hemispheres. So I would guess that there's some parallel between what I'm going to say now and that historical account that he gives. Because, well, it strikes me that we can plausibly see the journey of humanity since the time we were hunter-gatherers as, in some essential ways, a journey of oblique failure or inverse obliquity. It's a bit late in the day, perhaps, to be coining that term, but I take it the meaning is clear, and we've had lots of examples of it throughout. You know, if standard obliquity is being more able to achieve something when trying to do something else, then inverse obliquity is just being less able to achieve something when trying to achieve that thing. It's the same concept as backfiring, more or less. And it seems to me that we can, from an early 21st century Western perspective at least, see our core journey as a species in that way, as a journey in which we have pursued greater happiness, greater well-being, and perhaps for the most part, with important exceptions in many specific cases and specific ways, actually got farther and farther away from those goals. Perhaps not a straight line, but sometimes better, sometimes worse, and generally overall at this point it looks like worse. And certainly I'm not saying that's the definitive truth of our journey. I'm just saying that that's a view that seems to me horribly defensible and likely at least to capture some very important part of our journey. So you might have heard of the original affluent society theory developed and popularized by the anthropologist Marshall Salins, though certainly many have subscribed to similar ideas before and since. The theory basically says that we were in crucial ways a lot better off when we were living as hunter-gatherers, and maybe a simplistic explanation of why that is that we evolved as something like hunter-gatherers over millions of years, and in evolutionary terms, we've not had long at all since then, just maybe tens of thousands of years. And so generally, our deeper needs and capacities still fit that hunter-gatherer way of life very well. Like they're kind of fine-tuned for it. And while we are, of course, adaptable, we are not adaptable to the extent contemporary ways of life as they manifest for many of us presuppose. So if you think about how many of us are just like hunched over computer screens all the time, doing very technical jobs that mean nothing much to us, getting also very limited and non-diverse physical exercise, eating mostly this very processed food, lacking much of a community life as well. Like these kinds of things are millions of miles from how it's natural and healthy for us to live. So that if we could chuck it all away and go back to our prehistoric lives in the forests and the savannas, that would, I'm sure, take some getting used to and have obvious downsides. But still, it might actually be better for many of us. Like, things are for many people bad enough for that to be plausible, it seems to me, even before we consider the details. Because, yeah, Salins and others make specific points, of course. Here are a few of them. People in hunter-gatherer societies all did work that was highly skilled, physically and intellectually, diverse in nature and often enjoyable. All did work that they could see the immediate value and benefit of to themselves and their loved ones. Hard to imagine what that must be like today. Worked a lot fewer hours than we do, slept more and had more leisure time, had very flexible work hours. Non-flexible work hours are a very recent invention, of course. And it's fascinating reading someone like Foucault or more recently Barbara Adam about how societies struggled enormously with the transition to regular work hours, or even to the transition to the modern day clock and the modern day conception of time, because these were just so alien to their natural rhythms, as they, I think, most likely still are to many of our natural rhythms today. People in hunter-gatherer societies also generally had far healthier lifestyles and diets, lived in far more close-knit communities, lived in far more egalitarian communities. Yeah, for it to be possible for some people to have far more wealth than others, certain social arrangements are required. Private ownership of property, private land ownership being obvious examples, and those arrangements just made little sense in the context of fairly small nomadic tribes. Also in hunter-gatherer societies, there were no prescriptive religions or belief in judging gods, apparently. And now I'm thinking more of Robert Wright's book, The Evolution of God. I'm not sure Salins makes this point, although I think that Yuval Noah Harari, who is also quite big on the original affluent society theory, does mention this in his widely read book, Sapiens. So, yeah, basically in hunter-gatherer societies, there was, in some sense, no need for a god that judges and condemns, because everyone lived so closely together, everyone knew each other pretty well. You couldn't so easily get away with treating others badly, also because of there wasn't that power hierarchy that could shield the people at the top from suffering the negative effects of their treating others so badly, and also the lack of extensive private property meant that, sure, maybe you could steal some guy's axe or whatever, but then everyone knew about that, and where were you meant to hide it? And anyway, those relationships were just so practically crucial that you really couldn't afford to jeopardize them. Whereas when you invent agriculture and societies spread out and get larger, and not everyone really knows everyone else, and people start owning land and huts and items and cattle and so on, then cruel treatment of others in the tribe can start to appeal more and start to pay off in some way. And that, according to Robert Wright, is the point in our development when we invent judgmental gods and religions that tell us how to live and ideas of heaven and hell and so on and so forth. And yeah, it's a whole separate discussion, of course, but those have, I'd be inclined to argue, had a lot of downsides too, those kinds of beliefs. Anyway, you put this whole list together and it's a pretty appealing package, right? I mean, you can ignore that last point. You maybe also bear in mind in those times there would almost certainly not have been the kind of prolonged senility that people these days have to suffer often before they die, and that we, in the rest of society, perhaps don't talk about nearly as much as we should. But yeah, maybe most of us really were better off back then. It seems crazy, but makes you stop and think. I can't simply buy this view. I think of the best parts of modern life, the huge amounts of wonderful culture and learning we have at our disposal, the ability we have to really see the world, the great diversity of people out there, the variety of experiences we can have, the food, the thrills of science and technology, the sheer comfort, the low level of violence that most of us experience in our day-to-day lives, or at least physical violence, as Steven Pinker would be keen to emphasize. We should not ever fail to appreciate what we have, but a lot of this stuff is just not accessible to a lot of people a lot of the time. Not really, because they're sort of trapped in purgatorial lives doing largely meaningless work, with very little prospect of advancement out of that, with just these severe structural limitations on their dignity and purpose. And maybe even for those of us who are lucky enough to have greater access to the wonders of modernity, there are still more or similarly important things that we're losing. Anyway, reading and listening to lectures about this stuff, I've come across, for instance, in the work of David Graeber and Bob Black, this intriguing claim, backed up with historical references, that in fact, and this is what I say at the end there are records of many European settlers in the New World voluntarily deserting their settler communities to live with the native nomadic tribes and not returning. And there are, in comparison, almost no records of members of native nomadic tribes voluntarily deserting their communities to live in European settlements. And it is, I take it, that essentially European way of doing things that has become far more dominant and that we've taken to new extremes these days. So, well, if that's true, it seems like it's incredibly important in some way. It seems, a pretty shocking indictment of our way of life and what it does to us, or at least to many of us, those at the bottom particularly, and there are many, many people at the bottom. Also on this subject, please read George Monbiot's book, Feral, Rewilding the Land, the Sea, and Human Life, and particularly the chapter called Elopement, where he talks about this whole phenomenon. Anyway, when we hear these economists and politicians, and this is really the main thing I want to say here perhaps, when we hear these economists and politicians talking about how we've pulled all these people around the world out of poverty, well, I wouldn't want to outright dismiss that kind of claim, but I do wonder what exactly they mean by poverty in many of those cases, because I can imagine cases like, you live in a nomadic tribe in, an area of forest, maybe in the Amazon, say, and it's physically very difficult and quite dangerous life, and you have literally no money, and maybe even no private property, no formally recognized private property anyway. And yeah, it's tough, but actually you laugh a lot. You're close to your fellow tribes people, and your life feels meaningful, and you have your pride in what you do, and you have a sense of dignity. And then 20 years later, you're living in a small flat in a town, and you're working 6 days a week at a local abattoir or canning factory, and you hate that job and feel exploited and like you have no dignity or scope for pride in what you're doing, but you can't afford to lose the job because you couldn't easily find another one. And indeed, your tribe, what's left of it, has scattered in search of jobs, and the forest you previously lived in has largely been knocked down and the woods sold for a handsome profit for the formal landowners, adding significantly to local GDP. And you have a few dollars a month or a week now, maybe, which you can spend on consumer goods or maybe save up for a holiday. But your life feels pretty meaningless and there's not much to laugh about anymore. But technically, you've been pulled out of poverty, and men in far off cities are patting each other on the back about this and collecting international awards for it and so on. And that's a very stark case, of course. But I think many less stark but essentially similar cases exist. Uh, More money, more quantifiable material wealth, even just a bare a bare minimum amount of money and a bare minimum amount of material wealth um, do not necessarily equate to better life than the alternative. So yeah, there is a lot to this stuff. I feel I find I'm not really in doubt that in pursuing better lives, we have created far worse lives overall for many people. And if you think about the working lives of people in Victorian England, for instance, as the Industrial Revolution was taking off, maybe the argument could be made even more extremely at that point. Um, for me, I guess the big question from here is how we could get our contemporary societies to better accommodate our deep natures. Uh, and I do believe that perhaps, especially with the aid of new and emerging technologies, there are astonishing possibilities on that front. If we could only get out of the institutional and power structural straitjackets we've created for ourselves. I don't think we're necessarily just trapped and doomed by the direction we've taken, by the move away from nomadic, small tribe hunter-gathering and into, agricultural and then industrial and post-industrial big city civilization. And another book that's near the top of my reading list, Graeber and Wengrow's The Dawn of Everything, apparently has a lot to say on this. So yeah, read that if you're particularly interested in the discussion of this slide. I'll certainly be reading it soon. Speaking of those new and emerging technologies, if our journey up to now has been in many ways one of inverse obliquity, one of trying to live better lives and actually creating hellish conditions for many of us, well, yeah, we are creating certainly the means to make things better, but also the means to make things far, far worse. Uh, there is this fundamentally oblique side to human life, whereby we are constituted to grow and strengthen from harm and difficulty. We are anti-fragile, as Nicholas Nassim Taleb puts it. And so if we change the world we inhabit to remove all that causes us harm and difficulty, we will not be able to grow and strengthen in that way, and that may be our undoing. That's the sort of woolly vision of the future. But of course, there are plenty of other equally or more bleak visions of our future. Rather than dwell on them here, I'll just say, yeah, as we design artificial intelligences that are in many ways smarter than us, as we edit our own genes, as we artificially enhance our own bodies and brains, I'll add, as we continue to build and maintain for our defense weapons that could end all life on Earth. And as we develop virtual realities in which people can spend most or all of their lives. And yeah, basically, as we develop the technology necessary to recreate every element of ourselves and the world we inhabit according to our goals, we had better have in mind what I've called the poetry of productivity. We'd better have in mind obliquity. We'd better have in mind our propensity for hubris. We'd better have in mind and be respectful of the beautiful complexity of our reality. Yeah, I'm going to end there.